At the end of God's story, we see people from every nation, every language, and every ethnicity coming together to celebrate the wholeness they found in Jesus, their King. It's this beautiful picture of unity in the midst of diversity. Yet, in the 2,000 years since Jesus commissioned and empowered his church to live within that picture, that kind of unity has eluded us. We're still allowing barriers to divide us, generational, preferential, cultural, doctrinal, and racial. That's a great tragedy. That we might miss out on the fullness of this expression that Jesus had in mind when he talked about the church, this group of people who have been called to live out his kingdom on this earth. I'm afraid that we might miss out on the beauty of diversity that God incorporated into his design. I'm afraid that we might miss out on the urgency of the task that we have before us and the brevity of our lives. I'm afraid that we might miss out on the sacred nature of our calling, and that we might miss out on the promise to experience this uncommon kind of community that shouldn't be able to be found anywhere else. Kind of should blow everything else up out of the water. And that sounds so foreign to so many people who have been involved in church because they're saying, I've not ever experienced anything like that. Well, what we want to do is we want to be the full expression of community that Jesus had in mind when he designed his church. So we're taking the next 6 weeks to look at these images in the New Testament about the church. We've found 6 that we think are robust. They are packed with meaning, and I think they really inform who we are and what the church is supposed to be. So this week, the first week, we're talking about this image of shepherds and sheep, the church as flock. So one of the most common images in the Bible to talk about God and his people is this image of a shepherd and his sheep. And while that might be an image that's kind of foreign to a lot of us, it's a message that really resonated, clear visual for the people of Israel. Some of their most renowned ancestors were shepherds, Abraham, Rachel, Moses, and David. In fact, you might recognize the most famous psalm, Psalm 23, was written by one of those shepherds. It says, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He lets me rest in green meadows. He leads me beside peaceful streams. He renews my strength. He guides me along right paths, bringing honor to his name. Even when I walk through the darkest valley, I will not be afraid, for you are close beside me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort and protect me." So throughout the Bible, this metaphor is used to depict God as the shepherd and his people as the sheep. And there's something really cool about the relationship that exists there. I might also add that goats are a part of this image too. And these refer to people that aren't under the leadership of the shepherd, but kind of are among the sheep still. One of the really cool places that this happens is in Ezekiel 34, where this guy named Ezekiel, who's a prophet in his 30s, who has just watched his country get invaded by a foreign power because of their unfaithfulness, he hears from God and he speaks this message about Israel being sheep and God being the shepherd, but that there were all of these people who had been entrusted with leadership that actually were exploiting the sheep. They were abusing the sheep. They were just not good shepherds. And so God says that there's going to be a descendant of David that comes along that actually will be a really good shepherd. Well, that descendant that Ezekiel is talking about is Jesus. And when Jesus shows up, there are still these people who have been entrusted with leadership that are not doing a good job. They're still abusing and exploiting the people that they're called to lead. And these people are called Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, lawyers, and other religiously elite people. And throughout the Gospels, we see Jesus interacting with them, and he's usually interacting with them in kind of a harsh way, speaking very candidly to them. For example, in John chapter 9, they get angry because Jesus heals a man on the Sabbath day. He's a blind guy, and Jesus healed him. Well, they try to pull some kind of power play, and Jesus responds like this, and this is in John chapter 10. He says, I tell you the truth, anyone who sneaks over the wall of a sheepfold rather than going through the gate must surely be a thief and a robber. But the one who enters through the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep recognize his voice and come to him. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. After he has gathered his own flock, he walks ahead of them, and they follow him because they know his voice. They won't follow a stranger, they will run from him because they don't know his voice. This first visual does not take place in a pasture like I've kind of always imagined, but it takes place in a village. So imagine a bunch of homes next to each other in a village. Each one of those families owns one or two sheep. Well, you can't justify hiring a shepherd full time for one or two sheep. And so all of the people that lived in that village would kind of contribute, and they would hire a shepherd together. And so that shepherd, when it was time to take the sheep out to pasture, would come by the courtyards in these houses, and they would call. The courtyards looked something like this. They were in the middle of the house, and there was a door, obviously, that was open, and the sheep would run out when they heard the shepherd's voice, and they would follow him. Jesus' point is that sheep kind of have this really interesting thing. You can actually watch YouTube videos of this, where shepherds' voices actually draw sheep, and you can have just a random person go out and try to call these sheep, try to get them to come, and they won't do it. But as soon as a shepherd speaks, they come. That's what Jesus is referring to, that sheep know the shepherd's voice. And so as this shepherd is walking past these courtyards, he's calling them out, and they're coming out of the courtyard to follow him out to pasture. Other voices don't draw sheep, and anyone who has to resort to backhanded methods of getting into the sheep is a thief or a robber. That's the first image that Jesus uses. But then he continues, because those who heard the illustration didn't understand what he meant. And so he explained it to them. I tell you the truth, I am the gate for the sheep. All who came before me were thieves and robbers, but the true sheep did not listen to them. Yes, I am the gate. Those who come in through me will be saved. They will come and go freely and will find good pastures. The thief's purpose is to steal and kill and destroy. My purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd sacrifices his life for the sheep. A hired hand will run when he sees a wolf coming. He will abandon the sheep because they don't belong to him, and he isn't their shepherd. And so the wolf attacks them, scatters the flock. The hired hand runs away because he's working only for the money and doesn't really care about the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own sheep, and they know me just as my Father knows me, and I know the Father. So I've sacrificed my life for the sheep. I have other sheep too that are not in the sheepfold. I must bring them also. They will listen to my voice, and there will be one flock with one shepherd. So the second image does actually take place in the open country, where shepherds would lead sheep for grazing. So in the summer months, shepherd and sheep would sleep, spend the night out there in a roughly constructed stone-walled enclosure that looked something like this. And this would be called a fold. The tops of these were sometimes covered with thorns to keep the wild animals out. And inside, the sheep were safe as long as this entrance right here was sealed. And so the gate that it's being referred to, well, that's that. It's not a great translation because we think of the gate as a door that swings open and shut. That's not what this means. This means that there's an entrance. As long as the shepherd is here guarding this, the sheep inside are safe. And Jesus says, I am the gate. I am the entrance. I'm right here at the front of the fold. So Jesus is the only way into the kingdom. Jesus is the only way into the kingdom. He is our focal point of communion. We are his flock. We are learning to identify his voice and live in obedience to it. He's leading the way. He's guiding us. He's sustaining us. And he's protecting us. Jesus is the center. So there's 2 points that Jesus emphasizes here at the end, and I just want to extrapolate both of those out. The first one is that there is one voice. If Jesus is the center, and what that means is that there is one voice. Now, as part of his flock, we must learn to recognize and respond to his voice. And that sounds simple, but sometimes we learn to recognize and respond to other voices. And these other voices can cause unnecessary divisions or barriers between us. I'll give you some examples. Super pastors. I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but there are some people who have built an empire on their biblical interpretations, and that's okay, until it becomes the thing that we align with, which causes us to create unnecessary divisions. So whenever there's something that comes up, you run to find out what that person says about this, and then pretty much whatever they say, you go with. You join the following that they have. That creates unnecessary barriers. Second thing is cultural pressures. Churches can fall into the trap of allowing the voice of culture around them to dictate the decisions they make. The culture outside doesn't agree with you, so you have to change it. Cultural pressure is another voice that can cause barriers between us. Tradition. Churches can fall into the trap of allowing the voice of tradition around them to dictate the decisions they make. We've always done it this way, and so we have to continue doing it this way. I'll say that culture and tradition are two sides of the same coin. And this tension is really hard to balance. Because the question is, how much are we allowing tradition to shape what we do, and how much are we allowing cultural pressures to dictate what we do? And ultimately, what we should be doing is taking that coin and setting it aside. The question is, what does the one voice, Jesus, want us to do? And that's the question. That's the question. Here's another one, peanut gallery. There's all kinds of media and art around us. Hollywood writes movies. Nashville writes music. CNN writes headlines. All your friends on social media write all kinds of crazy stuff. And the reason that these can create barriers and divisions among us unnecessarily is that they kind of desensitize us to the differences that make a difference. They're actually kind of a lot of art is intended to make a statement. A lot of people use their social media to make statements, and they write blogs to make statements. And oftentimes those statements, they're polarizing. And so these are voices too that can fragment the church. Here's the last one, political views. We may have strong political sentiments, but there is no way Jesus would have political preferences and opinions jeopardizing the unity of his church. Now, whenever we're tempted to give authority to a voice other than Jesus, to give authority to super pastors, to cultural pressures, to tradition, to the people in the peanut gallery, to political figures and views, we should try to remember that sheep are the dumbest animals. Sheep are the dumbest animals. So there is one voice that's worth listening to, and as his flock, what we're trying to do is figure out what is that one voice saying, and then we follow that voice. There is one voice. The other thing that Jesus says in that last statement is that there is one flock. There is one flock. Now, this kind of gets interesting if you dive into the metaphor. If you look at the difference between a flock and a fold, you have a flock is like the group of sheep. The fold is that enclosure where they sleep, the enclosure where they're kind of safe. So let's just imagine that the church is a fold, right? Crossview is a fold, or the church down the street is a fold. Most of us are looking, in one way or another, for a more perfect fold. We look around at the fold that we're currently in, that we call church, and we see things that we don't like. We see things that we wish were different. And when enough things that we don't like add up, we leave that fold and we go searching for another fold which better suits our wants and preferences. I think the phrase is searching for greener pastures. But the problem is, upon being in that new fold for a while, we realize that there are many things wrong with that fold too. See, the search for the perfect group of sheep will always end in disappointment. The search for the perfect group of sheep will always end in disappointment. And that's because every fold is full of sheep. And again, sheep are the dumbest animals. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote this wonderful little book that's now a classic called Life Together. And in it, he warns about the dangers of falling in love with the idea of Christian community. Here's what he says. He says, those who love their dream of a Christian community more than they love the Christian community itself become destroyers of that Christian community, even though their personal intentions may be ever so honest, earnest, and sacrificial. They enter the community of Christians with their demands set up by their own law and judge one another and God accordingly. It is not we who build, Christ builds the church. Whoever is mindful to build the church is surely well on the way to destroying it. For he will build a temple to idols without wishing or knowing it. We must confess he builds. We must proclaim he builds. We must pray to him and he will build. We do not know his plan. We cannot see whether he is building or pulling down. It may be that the times which by human standards are the times of collapse are for him the great times of construction. And it may be that the times which from a human point are great times for the church are times when it's pulled down. It is a great comfort which Jesus gives to his church. You confess, preach, bear witness to me, and I alone will build where it pleases me. Do not meddle in what is not your providence. Do what is given to you, and do it well, and you will have done enough. And then finally, live together in the forgiveness of your sins. Forgive each other every day from the bottom of your heart. John 10, Jesus says that there are other sheep that are not of this fold to bring in. And that's a statement about the convergence of Jews and Gentiles into unity through Jesus' church. Now, this barrier between Jews and Gentiles is one that shows up in almost every single New Testament book as the first century Christians are fleshing out what it means to live out the reality of the church. It's a barrier that's going to come up over and over again over the next 6 weeks because it was a significant issue for the first Christians. These differences were much bigger than the differences that we face. Just speaking real bluntly, like the difference between a Jew and a Gentile in terms of the prejudice that they had towards each other and just the reality of the different lifestyles was far greater of a barrier than anything that we are dealing with at all. Yet the apostles did not let that be something that got in the way of unity. They said, there used to be a dividing wall of hostility between us. Jesus broke it down. There is no longer a difference between Jew and Gentile. There's no longer a difference between slave and free. See, the thing that brings everything together is that we have one shepherd. So there is just one flock. And that means that our unity is predicated not on whether or not the other sheep in the fold act the way that we want them to act, or whether or not we like the current pasture that we're in, but on the fact that he is our shepherd. We must learn the difference between differences that make a difference and the differences that don't make a difference. That's an N.T. Wright quote. We must learn the difference between differences that make a difference and differences that don't make a difference. There's a lot of use of the word difference in there. But another way to ask this, a more simple way to ask this is, what is worth dividing Jesus' church over? What is worth dividing Jesus' church over? The thing that you're frustrated with right now might be legitimate, but is it worth dividing Jesus' church over? Scott Eric Alt wrote, "It is not the point how many Protestant denominations there are, because there are a lot. The point is the scandal of division and the love of private judgment that has caused so much of it." And listen to this. The scandal would be no less if there were two denominations. and no greater if there were 2 million. Any division in the body of Christ is a scandal. Now, how can he say that? Well, he can say that because in Jesus' last prayer in John 17, he prayed for unity. He prayed for his church to experience the kind of oneness that he experienced with the Father. And the reason that he gives is so that people in the world would believe the message. So how does Jesus' call for unity challenge the way that we do church today? How does Jesus' call for unity challenge the way that we do and view church today? Look, there must be thousands of different things we could do or should do or would do or might do or won't do, but those things do not matter if they are secondary matters. As long as you have a group of people who are committed to recognizing and responding to the voice of Jesus, profound Christian community can happen. That's the only ingredient that you need, is a group of people who are committed to recognizing and responding to the voice of Jesus. And you can experience profound Christian community. St. Augustine wrote, "In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. But in all things, love, charity." Now that rule of thumb allows us to focus on the bigger picture, which is the shepherd is still at work. How crazy is it that the shepherd is out at work and the sheep that are in the fold are fighting with each other and they're building up barriers? And that little fold that we showed earlier, you got the sheep taking more rocks and they're building little sections inside because they are angry with each other or they don't like being around that sheep or that sheep, blah, blah, blah. The shepherd and sheep imagery actually is designed to convey a larger point, which is about God's heart. In Luke 15, tax collectors and other notorious sinners came to listen to Jesus teach. And that made those people that I mentioned earlier, the Pharisees, teachers of religious law, complain that he was associating with such sinful people, even eating with them. So Jesus told them this story. If a man has 100 sheep and one of them gets lost, what will he do? Won't he leave the 99 others in the wilderness and go to search for the one that's lost until he finds it? And when he finds it, he will joyfully carry it home on his shoulders. When he arrives, he'll call together his friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, because I have found my lost sheep." In the same way, there will be more joy in heaven over one lost sinner who repents and returns to God than over 99 others who are righteous and haven't strayed away. If you consider yourself a faithful sheep, don't stray away while the master is in pursuit of his lost sheep. There are so many sheep that still need to be brought into the fold, and that's what Jesus is focused on. That's what he wants. That's what his heart yearns for. That's what he came to do. That's what he commissioned his church to participate in. And so how ridiculous is it that the church that he commissioned to join with him in the reconciliation of all things, the group of people that he has invited to be about his heart in the world, fighting amongst themselves because they've not realized that there is one voice and just one flock. We have to stop building walls between each other. If we listen to what the shepherd is saying, he is saying, "I'm going after the lost sheep." And we can too.